I am Laura Schueller. I am a mathematician through and through. Um, I just want to tell you my story. I'll try to give you the shortened version. But right after college, I went to Penn State with 60,000 of my closest friends for undergrad. After college, I got certified to teach high school, and I did go to teach high school. I had a BS in math and then a secondary certification for my bachelor's degree, and I taught high school, and I really loved it. And at the time, I right after college, I married my sweetheart, who also had gotten an undergraduate degree in math and a certification at Penn State, and he did not love teaching high school, and so he decided that he wanted to go back and get his PhD in math, and I decided I would go back and get my master's degree in math because 1,000 years ago, back when I was got right after I got my college degree, if you got your master's degree, you had a permanent certification in the state of Pennsylvania. So we went to graduate school, and it didn't take long before I realized how much I loved math differently than I had sort of thought about in undergrad. And I stayed on, and I got my PhD in math. Also, so my husband and I both got our PhDs in math from the University of Kentucky. And while we were doing that, I had two small children. So now we've got these babies and we have these PhDs. And so we decide to go out onto the job market. And, with the sort of standard two-body problem, everybody sort of comes up with their solution. Ours was that we would sort of apply broadly. Whoever got the best job would take it. And then the other one would be a stay-at-home parent and sort of do things as they saw fit. Okay, so this is where we entered the job market. We ended up with having a number of schools that offered for us to share a job, which we had never even considered. And so we ended up at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, where my husband still is today. And I was there for about 15 years. I got tenure there. It is really in some ways like the Disneyland of colleges. It is well resourced. It is small, idyllic. It's got, a quad where people play frisbee as soon as it's above 60 degrees. It's got almost all the students live on campus, and they're all between 18 to 22 and come from high schools that have prepared them for college. Okay, that's great. After being there for 15 years, having my tenure, I realized that this was actually not the population that I wanted to serve, which newsflash probably should have come a lot more than 15, earlier than 15 years in, but alas. And so I left and went and worked at a local community college for about a decade. And while I was there, I started doing a lot of work on their redesign efforts and their placement efforts. And it gave me a whole new appreciation for what math looked like for the masses of students who were not showing up at places like Whitman. And also, in the ways that things were sort of weird, like they had higher requirements for some things and much lower requirements for others between the two schools. And so it was a very interesting place. After that, I went on and started doing policy work, both at the state of Washington, at the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, eventually for the national nonprofit organization Complete College America. And since last fall, I have been on my own, consulting and working with some research groups and really just trying to sort of share what it is that I have learned and with all of the people out in the world. So that's who I am. What I'm hoping that you'll all do is just take a couple of minutes and let me know in the chat who you are and where you're coming to us from and what it is that you do there. Benjamin, did you have a raised hand?
My apologies, I hit a weird button.
Oh, oh, Andrew, congratulations on a great conference the last few days from Just Equations. Um, University of Arkansas. Oh, PLU. Oh, you're one of my Washington people. I'm still in Walla Walla. Um, Gavin, it's so fun to have you here. I have to say, I see all of your messages popping up all the time. University of Denver, Alaska Anchorage. Oh, yes. All right. So we have sort of, this is fantastic. Oh, APLU, good. Um, this is sort of this is exactly the audience I was hoping for. So this is fantastic. And so um, I'm glad to have everybody here. Like I said, I hope that I will talk about some things today that are actually useful for you. Feel free to stop me, and obviously, I hope that we can continue the conversation. That this isn't sort of a one and done hour. That if some things come up that you think, "Wow, she said something that I'd like to dig into deeper," that we can connect about those things right on Zulip or by email or somewhere after the fact. So I just want to say, um, today, right, where I really want to talk about co-requisites. And for that, I want to just first start out with really understanding that co-requisites, this is not a brand new thing. For some people, it may be new, but this is not a brand new thing. Co-requisite courses have been used by just a variety of institutions, community colleges, highly selective colleges, universities, but all kinds of institutions to try to increase student success for over a decade, right? We're not at the tip of the spear here. This is sort of this is something that's been going on. But who is using them and how they're using them, like everything else, continues to change. So just to really, is there anybody that is currently on the call who is currently teaching a co-requisite course? Is there anybody? All right, that's great. So I'm going to just keep going then, and like I said, I hope that I'm telling you some things that are brand new, but if not, I'm sorry ahead of time. Um, All right, so I will say I think we all probably probably need to do this more often in our work and in our lives, and that is start with the end goal and work backward, as opposed to trying to just keep going forward with things that we think are good. And so I want to tell you from me, this is me personally, Laura Schueller. I can't speak for Tipsy or Ember or APLU or anybody else. For me, when I think about the end goal. And I zoom way out. I really think about the end goal in two categories. One is things that are really good for students. I want students to have increased social and economic mobility, and I want them to set aspirational educational goals. And by aspirational, I don't necessarily mean educational goals that are going to lead to them getting rich, right? Or but whatever their aspirations are, to be able to go back and be productive members in their communities, or to be able to, right, work in an environment that sort of aligns with what they care about and what feeds their soul, whatever. But so those are the things that I really want for students. And then there's also the stuff that I really want for our society, right? I want there to be vibrant communities. I want us to have a highly skilled workforce. That's not the only things I want for our society or for our students, but when I think about the end goals, those are the things I'm thinking about. Like really 30,000 foot view, what are the things that are going to sort of why am I doing this work? This is sort of my why. And I realize that education is a tool toward this, right? High quality education is not going to increase social and economic mobility for everybody. It is certainly not going to be the only thing that contributes to vibrant communities, but I do think it can help, right? And so when I think about that and I think about what my sphere of influence is and where it is that I actually work and live in this world, I think about sort of how it is that education can help us with this. And so then I start thinking about, okay, so what I want are successful students with sort of these things in mind. And so when I think about improving student success, which is part of the title of this talk, right? When I think about improving student success, I think one of the things that I think it's really important to talk about is to that yes, part of what I want to happen is more students to complete, right? Their degrees, the sort of intermediate milestones to completing those degrees, which means being successful in their courses, all of those things. Yes, those things I want to happen. And I think because those things are relatively easy to count, and because it's really easy to sort of connect those with sort of the traditional success metrics at the university level, people really focus on that when they talk about student success. But I will tell you, for me as a human being who cares about the students that were in my classroom and all the students that we serve, I also want to think about having an improved student experience, right? How are the students experiencing their academic life? And also, I want to think about how are our students prepared both for their next classes, for their careers, to return to their communities, to all of the things, right? And so when I think about improving student success, some of those things are really hard to quantify, and some of them we don't really know about until much further down the road. But those are the things that I'm thinking about. These are the sort of the three legs on the stool for me when I think about student success: the actual completions of the courses and the programs of study, the student experience, and how prepared students are to go on and sort of do what's next. Again, like I said, this is just me. I do encourage you to think about sort of what is it that you're trying to do? Why are you in this work? What is it is your goal? And what would improved student success mean for you? Sort of what pieces of this? And so I think it's important when we're talking about this to go back and sort of visit a little bit of history. So many decades ago, which when I hear the number, it doesn't sound as many, but because I'm old, but many decades ago, right, that the sort of standing for courses in colleges and universities was that students had a right to fail, right? They could sign up for whatever class they want to do. And, if they were prepared, great. If they weren't prepared, they had a right to fail. They still had to pay the tuition. They still had to, do all the things, but they did have this right to fail. And I think that really sat with a lot of people as being very uncomfortable, right? Because they were in their classrooms and they had these students who, like in the big picture, we've said that they've got the right to take it. They can sign up for whatever they want, but they were seeing these students and they were thinking that it didn't matter how hard that student worked. It didn't matter how often they showed up. It didn't matter what they did. Their chances of being successful were just so low. And there was, with the absolute best of intentions, people started recognizing. So if you think about calculus, they were having these students show up in calculus, and they were recognizing that these students didn't have the proper preparation to be able to engage with the calculus content. And so they started as right they were coming from under-resourced communities or high schools that didn't even offer the courses that might normally give students a rigorous college preparatory experience, right? Those courses didn't even exist. And so with good reason, right? The conventional wisdom was, okay, well, if they don't have it before they get here, we can just give it to them. And so they developed these prerequisite courses. And they said, okay, so if they're not ready for calculus on day one, then maybe what we need to do is to develop a pre-calculus course. Or, oh, well, it turns out in my pre-calculus course, the students aren't being highly successful. I think it's because their algebra is not that strong. So let's develop an intermediate algebra class, and so on, until you had some community colleges that literally had 5 or 6 levels, right? Because they just kept going backwards. Well, they still had these sort of holes. Maybe we need another course behind and another course behind and another course behind. And so this explosion of prerequisites happened. And unfortunately, right, with the absolute best of intentions, they ended up really harming the exact students that they intended to help. And so students, when people started looking back at the data, which frankly did not happen nearly quickly enough, but when people started really looking back at the data and understanding the harm of these prerequisites, right, there's all kinds of understanding that there was really, now we had this pipeline, right? This huge pipe, and each course sort of was a piece of pipe that was screwed together. And you were having these students leak out at every level. And they were either leaking out because life got in the way and they couldn't just add one more term on, or they were leaking out because they didn't pass the prerequisite course. But even the ones who passed, what they remembered from the previous course, like two courses down the road, they weren't like the learning was not happening in the way that people expected it to happen. They weren't serving the populations that these prerequisites were frankly designed to serve. Okay. So there's a lot of history, obviously, that we will leave out. But some of these big pieces that I think are really important is one of the things that came along, the Dana Center had a big hand in this, was math pathways. And this was the understanding that, and to be honest, that this was partly related to uh, like the space race, the idea we were going to get all these students ready to work at NASA, and so everybody needed to have calculus, even if they were going to really their big dream in life was to be the poet laureate of the United States, and so um, people started to recognize all the major math organizations, AMATIC, SIAM, MAA, AMS, literally everybody recognized that students shouldn't all be going in the same direction, that they should be taking courses for their quantitative reasoning requirements in college that were related to what it is that they wanted to do. And so we started seeing students who before had been really heading toward calculus, now heading toward statistics or some other kind of quantitative reasoning course or some other pathway specific for business or something like that. And all these math pathways got designed. And at some colleges that trickled down, that true math pathways, where they also it gave them a chance to say, okay, wait, so are the prerequisites that we have in place the ones that still make sense or not? Some colleges said, listen, we're just going to get everybody through college algebra and then we'll figure it out after that. All kinds of sort of versions of that happened. Um, but frankly, there was a lot of success there. But one of the big things that didn't happen in a lot of that early math pathways work is people didn't really get rid of all those prerequisite courses that they had built, right, in response to the right to fail. And we started seeing colleges saying, listen, the math pathways is great. It's wonderful not to have students in these STEM courses who have no intention of doing STEM and that's helping us and all. But we still have all these crazy prerequisite pipelines that are not serving students well. And it was at that point that people really started investigating whether or not co-requisites, right? Like instead of trying to rehash all of high school, really trying to do just-in-time support with some kind of co-requisite course maybe made more sense. And that's kind of where we had been. And I think one of the things that's really interesting for me is not so much, right, that we're sort of seeing more colleges and universities think about how co-requisites can serve them, but really that the whole point of co-requisites has changed. And so I just want to be clear here so that we're all like on the same page. Like when I'm talking about a co-requisite, I'm talking about a course that is taken concurrently with what I'm calling a gateway math course. And so if you're in, for example, so I want to just stay in STEM for a minute. If you're in the community college space, that might be pre-calculus because that might be the first credit-bearing course that counts toward your program of study toward graduation. If you're at a university, that might be calculus one, right? It sort of depends on what your context is. And so I'm using the word gateway just to be sort of more generic there. But the idea is that it's designed to provide not a rehash of everything that a student might have seen in a fully resourced high school curriculum, college preparatory curriculum, but really it's designed to provide just-in-time support for the foundational skills and to help improve student success in that gateway course. Its sole purpose is to support students in being successful in that gateway math course. And it really served as an alternative to these traditional standalone prerequisite courses. All right. But the idea that I think is really interesting for where we are right now is how co-requisites are being used. Sort of the first The first stab at co-requisites was really to replace standalone prerequisite courses. Either one prerequisite course was changed from being prerequisite to being co-requisite, or people did backward design and eliminated entire prerequisite sequences and developed these co-requisite courses that were taken alongside statistics or quantitative reasoning or calculus or pre-calculus. And really what they did was eliminated a bunch of courses that had come before them. And that's still happening today all over the country, and at all different kinds of colleges. Another way that they're being used is as an option for sort of select student populations to their prerequisite courses. So for example, if a student was really, kind of close to being deemed college ready, maybe those students, instead of taking a full standalone course, would take the co-requisite course. The problem I think with that is it's introducing all kinds of crazy sort of unintended consequences about who takes the prerequisite versus the co-requisite, why students are making those choices and all. But it is one of the ways that it's being used right now. But I think for me, one of the most interesting ways that co-requisites are being used right now, if is to really make courses accessible to students in ways that are not official. So for example, when I think about replacing standalone prerequisite courses, right, the idea was a student would get placed multiple levels below their gateway course, and now they're getting placed directly into their gateway course and with this co-requisite support. Okay, that's the replace the standalone. When I talk about increasing student success, like especially in calculus, this is where we're seeing this the most, is we have these colleges who were always open to having students in their calculus class, right? Like, so I'm going to go back to Whitman College where I started, right? So at Whitman College, there is no STEM course that's offered that is below Calculus 1, right? There just isn't. And so for all these years, the whole time I was there, right, and beyond, if a student came in and they were interested in STEM, right, and so they were going to need to take calculus, the starting place for them, if they didn't have AP credit or something else, was to start in Calculus 1. And for most of their students, that was fine, right? They came in fully prepared. They came from these well-resourced high schools. They had taken pre-calculus or even calculus or internet the IB courses or all of these things, right? And they could just start in Calculus 1. Now, for the few who weren't ready but still wanted to do STEM, they sent them off. They said, maybe you can, go do some wedges on an Alex uh, wheel, or you can go do a class at the community college which offers pre-calculus, or you can do a MOOC about pre-calculus if you don't want to spend any money. And then once you're ready, then you can come take our calculus course. But basically, they outsourced all of that preparation for calculus to other places. And the reality was those students never came back to calculus. They just didn't. And so what they realized is as things started to change, as they moved to a broader student population, right? They diversified their student population. They went from, for example, a 7% Pell rate up into a 20% Pell rate. So they were taking students from different communities than they had taken them from before, who were coming from high schools that didn't offer the kind of preparation that they were used to seeing in their classrooms. And so they had a decision to make. And that is if they really wanted to make sure that they opened this door to calculus to these students, it's not that it was officially closed. Those students could still continue to just sign up for calculus, but they weren't successful, right? And so what did it mean to really open the door for those students to calculus? And I think what they had this hard decision to make. Did they want to develop a pre-calculus course, right? Or did they want to really think about a co-requisite calculus course? And this is why I talked about the history part, because what they did was they kind of did a thoughtful review of history, and they said, hey, wow, we don't want to fall into that same trap. We don't want to fall into the same trap after the right to fail, folks, where they just developed these prerequisite courses hoping that it was gonna really increase the student success. They said, we already saw what happened with that. And so they really jumped right in and are on their, I don't know, first or second version of correct calculus, and it is continuing to change. That same thing is happening, right? I think the University of Alaska Fairbanks has it, right? Like they at UT Austin, right? With Uri Treisman, his program has been very similar to a correct calculus that's been around for decades. There are lots of people that are doing it not to change who is eligible to take calculus, but to change how successful students are in calculus. And I will say the interest in that basically exploded with COVID, right? So as students started to come out of preparatory, even these high schools where they before were seeing students come out really prepared to go into their calculus courses, faculty were starting to see these students were coming out, and because of changes that had happened during COVID and online instruction, and because of all kinds of other things, they felt like there was a growing number of students who needed something different. And so many of those colleges are now at that exact same crossroads of deciding, how do we really serve those students? And they have the choice now of developing or increase a pre-calculus, or increasing the number of students that get placed into pre-calculus, or just growing that prerequisite pool of students, or do they invest right now in trying to do a co-requisite? And I will say, I mean, I think it would be obvious from what I'm talking about, right? Like where my vote would be, where to put that energy, where you actually have a chance to really serve those students differently. And so I will say, it's not easy, right? So as soon as you say, okay, we're gonna start developing these co-requisites. I will say, developing a new prerequisite course or increasing the number of students that are in a prerequisite course, that's also not easy, but it's easier, right? Yeah, placement might have to change, advising slightly might have to change. Your program maps for what students take when, they might have to change a little, course offerings might have to change. But the idea is basically that you can, right, you're going to plug students into one kind of course instead of the other kind of course, and it's going to lengthen the pathway, right? It's easier. Not as effective, not as good for students, but easier. Whereas if you try to do co-requisites, just the number of different touch points, right? So if you want to start offering, for example, let's say I'm offering calculus. If I'm in a really small liberal arts school, maybe it's not as big a deal to add, a one or two extra credits, excuse me, for students. We might be able to fudge a little bit with the faculty contact hours, and we can just make that work. The students are paying one price for the semester, whether they take 15 or 19 credits. So yeah, having them take a couple extra credits is not the end of the world. It doesn't change things financially. But in most college situations, and certainly in large university systems, and where you have um, faculty unions and all of these kinds of things, um, adding co-requisites is much more complicated, right? There's the placement and advising piece. Obviously, there's the faculty teaching loads and scheduling, which that little hexagon should probably be twice the size. How students are scheduled and related, what their financial aid will and won't pay for. For colleges that are getting rid of courses, for example, if you're getting rid of your pre-calculus, or if you're getting rid of some prerequisite, really thinking about how that affects other departments, right? If other departments are saying, wait, but we used to use that college algebra as our requirement, as the as the gatekeeper for students coming into our major, how is that going to have to change? How often are you going to be able to offer these courses, in what modalities? How is it going to change the program maps? Uh, and then really on that left side, two things that I think a lot of people don't think about is, what does that do to the university budget, right? What's the return on investment if you implement these co-requisite courses? I will tell you, there's lots of work out there that it's actually a really positive ROI for universities, but really understanding that and selling it to the decision makers on campus, it's not free, right? That takes time and energy and all of those things. And I think one of the biggest things for me is this idea of professional development. Because if all of a sudden you're going to change which students are sitting in front of you and what it is that you're expecting them to learn and how you're expecting them to learn, that doesn't come for free, right? Most of us, if you're like me, right, I got certified to teach high school before I went on and did my PhD, but I would venture to guess that there are a very large number of people that are teaching university mathematics courses right now who have never had a class in how to teach, right? A methods course or even a chance to sort of reflect on what it means to for students to learn and to prepare for that. Um, and so for that reason, I think it's really important for colleges that are thinking, wow, that co-requisite seems really interesting. Maybe that could really help us. We don't have the pass rates that we would like to in our calculus class. I would really like to think about how we could do that. It's really useful for them to work with each other, to talk to each other, to be involved in something like the conversations, that Ember has um, on Zulip or and with other people, because there are just so many places that frankly faculty don't normally interact with, right, in their day-to-day work that they would need to interact with if they were going to sort of start implementing these co-requisites. And whether that's bringing in sort of outside help from somebody, or whether that's working in, with a cohort of colleges and universities that are trying to do this all together, I think it's just really hard to do alone. And it's hard. Like I said, I think it's really, really hard. But for me, there are some bright spots. And one of those bright spots, I think, is it goes back to this sort of misunderstanding when people started developing all these prerequisites. And that is when you're developing a co-requisite, your goal is not to reteach everything that they might have seen in sort of your dream high school scenario before they come to your class, right? That is not the point. The point is to create a high quality parent class, so be that calculus or whatever that you wanted to co-rec, and then work backwards to think about what it is that students would actually need. Okay, I think so. Absolutely. So Beatrice, I just want to, I'm going to share them with Tipsy, who will then put them with all the other materials, including the recording. So yes, you will definitely have a copy of the slides. Um, so like I said, change is hard, but you're not trying to redo all of high school math. You're working backwards to just sort of pick and choose, right? The second thing is you are not alone. So I mentioned earlier that people have been doing co-recs for a decade, right? Over a decade. And so there are a lot of people out there who have tried things. Some worked better than others, right? And that way, yeah, and you can learn from them. So it's a way for you to just really stand on the shoulders of people who have already done a ton of the work, but it also is an opportunity for you to be the shoulders for somebody else. I think one of the things for me that was really freaky when I first started working in co-requisite design is it felt like this whole other beast, right? Like I had been teaching for a long time. I cared deeply about my teaching. I experimented, right? I mean, I did flipped classrooms. I did all kinds of things, right? And but for me, the idea of taking these students who basically we had identified as not having the things that we would normally think of them having, and sort of doing it just in time, for me just seemed like otherworldly. And I will say, one of the best things that ever happened was somebody talking to me about how much I already did the things in co-requisite that we do in co-requisites, but then formalized them and gave me extra time to do them. So for example, I don't know how many of you have ever taught calculus and have gone through your calculus class from day one to the last day and never done any review of the stuff that came before it. But if you have, you must have had a really magical class, because I always felt like I was constantly constantly going back, right? Whether it was reviewing the unit circle or whether it was talking about, factoring and rationalizing denominators. There is some question about why I was doing some of these things, but alas. Um, right, I was constantly going back and reviewing those things. Or I was in a situation at one place where we spent literally the first 2 weeks of the semester doing a chapter 0, right, which was kind of a rehash of everything that we had kind of hoped students knew before coming in. So I was already doing that kind of scaffolding. And what Corequisites did was formalize a way to do that scaffolding so that you didn't have these naked skills in the first 2 weeks of the semester, but you were doing more like the natural scaffolding that I would already be doing in a course, and formalizing it. So that really thinking, what is it that a student needs to be successful with this calculus content, and how can I scaffold that? The other thing is, look, we give our students time to practice, whether it's in homework, whether it's in class, whatever. We're going to continue to do that in co-requisites, but in more formal ways, right? Really making time, because the students, if things were coming at them like a garden hose before, it's more like a fire hose now, right? Like, how do we make sure that we give time for them to really internalize the things that we want them to do? And the ideas of metacognition, right? The ideas of how am I learning? What role does growth mindset play? How does all the student success stuff factor in? And I will say, I was not as good about doing that intentionally in many of my classes early on. I got better as I taught in my probably third decade of teaching. I was much better about sort of putting that into all of my classes, but really being intentional about it in co-requisites, I think, is so important, because it is such a huge part of both supporting students, especially those for whom those skills kind of are things that got dropped out in our COVID years, to really help those students, and that normally we might have been spending some time on in those prerequisite courses, to really think about what it takes to be successful. And it also means for us to really reflect on what it means to be successful. Also, I think that the two things on the bottom are sort of more touchy-feely, but they're really important to me. And that is, I can make a real difference for students who may never have had access to my courses before, right? So if I think about the Whitman example, or some of those other examples, there were students who just never would have come into my calculus class. They didn't feel like they were prepared. They didn't feel like there was any pathway for them to get there, or they were going to get washed out in one of the many prerequisite courses. And the idea that those students are now my students too was just so much fun, right? It really just broadened who all I was seeing in my classes. Um, and the second thing is, and I will say, I know not everybody feels this, but really reimagining what's possible for me, it can be really fun, right? That's not saying it's not exhausting. Trust me, I understand that's part of the but we really are, those of us that are highly reflective teachers, we're constantly changing, right? Like, very few of us are putting the same PowerPoint slides up that we used 30 years ago to teach a course, right? Like, we're constantly doing this kind of changing. But this is like, what happens if we just clear the slate and imagine what's possible, like from ground zero, and doing that with a cohort of other people who are really excited about reimagining that, I am telling you, is incredibly energizing and incredibly fun. And the nice thing is, there's already this great data about how successful you can be. And so it's great fun. It's wildly different than maybe you have thought about things before, but there's still sort of um, this safety net that says people have done this. It's going to work. It's going to be okay. There are ways to do this successfully. So, I will say that one of the things that I often hear from people is, a co-rec, that would be awesome, but that just seems too big. It's just too big. How about other forms of student support? And I will say, it's not one or the other. It's yes and. For me, always. I did some work in a tutoring center, and in fact ran a tutoring center, and I will tell you, those are fantastic places for students to make connections and to get that kind of small group or one-on-one help that we hope that they will get. But I think any of us who is really in tune with our students understands that the students who go to the tutoring centers, especially early and regularly throughout the terms, are not necessarily the students who need to go to the tutoring centers. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, right? Whether they feel like, whether they're embarrassed, whether they literally just don't have time, whether things don't work out for them, all of those things. And I will say that same thing is true for office hours, right? And for supplementary instruction. And I think faculty have gotten much better at increasing the ways that students do those things. But but it's but it's still hard. And so I will say one of the things I want to talk about briefly is embedded tutors and supplementary instruction. I think lots of people have had a lot of luck with embedded tutors and supplementary instruction, but one of the problems is the money doesn't work, right? So they get grants or they use student activity fees or something for these embedded tutors or supplementary instructions, but it's not really built into the model. And so I will say that when I think about co-requisite instruction, right, we think about it being for almost universally, the places where we find it successful is if the institutions have charged the credit for it, right? Because in terms of if they are getting access to a faculty member for extra hours each week, then they pay for those in the same way that they would pay for them for any other course. And so I see that there's a question in the chat about how have institutions worked out fees for students, assuming that co-recs are not offered for student credits. I will say I think that's a bad way to start. I'm just telling you right now, I think getting everybody used to the idea that this is an instructional support that costs money up front. Because if well, there are colleges that found like the foundation would pay for these extra credit, their foundation would pay for their extra credit, or they could use associated student body fees or whatever, like some of the other things. But if they get students used to having these services basically for free, then it becomes almost impossible to then add on that extra credit later, right? The political capital it takes to do that is nearly impossible. I do want to say that co-requisites aren't the only way to do things, right? Lots of people have done other things. I will say when I think back about recitation sections, I think lots of big universities, right? Like you may have this huge calculus section, and then students are meeting in smaller recitation sections with a graduate student, a TA, or whatever. I will say your structure is really good for thinking about co-requisites. I think that the hard part is really changing the focus, right? That a recitation section is not the place for a student to just get homework help or to review the things that happened in class, but really thinking about recitation sections and however many hours you would need to schedule for those recitation sections for a student to actually get the just-in-time instruction that they would need and to get the metacognition and all the other things that we would normally put in a co-requisite. And then I will say there are a number of colleges that have really thought about, for them, especially if they have a large number of students that are part-time students or that can't do the extra hours, they have said, we want to keep all the structures of a co-requisite course, but instead of, for example, having a 4 or 5 credit course, instead of a 3 credit course in a semester, or a 7 or 8 instead of a 5 and a quarter system, instead of taking that in one term, what we're going to do is we're going to build it just like we would a co-requisite with the just-in-time instruction and all of those things. And then we're going to, like saltwater taffy, we're going to spread it out over two quarters or 2 semesters so that students are really just doing, the normal 4 or 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, if they're on semesters or quarters, credits each term. And I mean, there are some big colleges, some little colleges that are having great success with that, right? That is fantastic. I will say you still have this leaky pipe problem that we talked about at the very beginning of losing some students between. But I will say, for example, right, if you look at what's happening at Sonoma State or some of those other places that are using these stretch courses, their data is really good, right? They found some ways to use that as an alternate to co-requisites, which they just didn't feel like they could make work within their system. All right. I do want to do some quick asides here. I will just tell you because I want to be completely upfront. I'm a huge fan right now of co-requisites. I think that there is a lot of upside. I think we really serve students well when we have these really strong supports in place that are intentional and built around the way students learn, right? Without naked skills for 2 terms, and then all of a sudden we hope they can apply them later, but really with this just in time, in context preparation. But I didn't start here, right? I started in a place that was really almost anti co-requisite. But also just more generally, there were some things about me personally that got in the way of student success. And and I had to sort of walk through the door. And I will tell you, so I just want to talk about these 3 things because they've really I can't even imagine how I thought them before, but I'm telling you that I did. And I'm telling myself that I did. The one is I thought I could recognize the students who would make it and the ones who wouldn't based on really limited data, right? Like, so if I saw a student and they were really struggling in a pre-calculus course, I would say to myself, the student never could have been successful if they'd have started in calculus. Or if I had a student that was right in an intermediate algebra course or a college algebra course, and they were just struggling, I would say to myself, this student would never make it as a STEM student, right? And I had the arrogance or the ego or whatever to say, that student does not approach college and thinking and the way I did. And I clearly was successful as a student. I have a PhD in mathematics and got tenure at the college that I chose right out of graduate school, all those things, right? So if the more that student doesn't look like me, the more that student doesn't act like me, and I don't mean like physically look like me, but that doesn't sort of react to things that I do, that isn't sort of engaged by the things that I am, I really thought that those were extra data points to show me that that student wasn't going to be successful. And I needed to really get over myself on that one and get out of my own way. The second thing was I put way too much emphasis, especially in calculus, on what I wanted, how I wanted students to think and what I wanted them to think about if they were eventually going to be math majors. And let's face it, right? The number of students in introductory calculus classes that go on to be math majors is really, really, really small. And I encourage you to try to find your own campus data about that. And I would love it if somebody could come up with an example where it's more than 5%, because I'm telling you, most places it's well under 2, right? And so I was putting all this emphasis on, yeah, but what about when the student needs to do partial fraction decomposition in differential equations? And what about when the student, and the reality is the students that were in front of me were trying to get through 1 year of calculus so that they could apply to med school, right? And so really knowing sort of what the role of calculus was and what they wanted to do. The third thing had to do with teaching. I thought that if I said it, that they learned it, right? And that's probably the biggest fallacy of all. That's not how learning happens. And it's funny if I think back to my own like graduate school days, and I can tell you I was in an algebraic topology class, and that faculty member talked so fast, and I wrote as fast as they talked, and I did not understand one thing. And then I would leave class with this packet of my handwritten notes based on that lecture. And I would go back and I would spend hours upon hours trying to decipher those things so that I was ready for the next class. And in my mind, if a student wasn't able to use the classroom time and follow along and know what I was saying as I was saying it, in my mind, they were doing that same thing that I did in that algebraic topology class that I cared so much about. And the reality was that wasn't happening, right? And so then I had to decide what am I doing up here? If they're not learning, I'm not teaching, right? And so what I need to do is think about what are the ways that I can really change what's happening in my classroom for those contact hours. I'm actually with those students, and so that real learning takes place. Some other things that I think are really important is I think as a system, we spend, whether it's through placement or whether it's with, weed out courses or whatever. I think we do a lot of trying to sort students into the students that belong and the ones that don't belong in courses, in programs of study or whatever. And I think we just need to throw that away, right? And add a couple of like the UPP into there and change that sorting into supporting and really thinking about how it is that we can take the students that we have, assume that they all are the students that belong there, and figure out how we can support them in being successful. I will say, data is not a four-letter word. I mean, yes, data is a four-letter word, but data is not a four-letter word. If people hadn't gone back and looked at the data, I feel sure they would not have recognized that prerequisites just weren't working the way that they thought they were. And so we really do need to think about what it is that we want to measure, and how can we measure it? Not trying to use crazy proxies. Think about what are our throughputs? How are students actually getting to completion? And I also want to say this because I think it's important. I think in a lot of sort of the math pathways work and in a lot of co-rec work in general, people think that there's such a de-emphasis of algebra, that algebra is actually a bad word. And I will say, look, I'm an algebraist. Nobody thinks algebra is more interesting or more fun or better than I do, but the right algebra for the right students is the thing that I am most concerned about. I am not interested in algebra for the sake of algebra. That is awesome when a student is in eighth or ninth grade and they have nothing but time. That is not what I want to do with a student who is coming to be in this really limited, financial aid strapped university experience, right? I want to make sure that we're really getting to the algebra that they need and that makes sense for them. That is not the same as saying I don't think algebra is important. I just think that we need to really think about it. And to be fair, I think we could be doing a lot better with calculus too, right? Like calculus reform has only been going on for like what, 40 years. And we still, I think in a lot of places are teaching the exact same calculus as 40 years ago. I also, but this, I promise we're getting close here. I want to say that there's no one thing that if we do it, that we're going to be done. And even there are a bunch of things that if we do them all, we're going to be done, right? We're going to just have to keep iterating because our students keep changing. The world that they're in keeps changing. But there are definitely some things that we know are necessary, right, to really increase student success. That is one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning, and that is that you need the right math for the right path, right? Really thinking through what math is going to best serve students to be good members of the community, to be good members of their, right, and to be successful in their programs of study. We want to increase access to students, right? We want to really make sure that everybody who is interested in doing calculus has a pathway to get there. We want to make sure that we structure things with low administrative burdens, right? It's not good enough for it to be available and to look good on paper. It really has to, students actually have to be able to access things, right? It's not good enough to say, listen, we have a tutoring center and it's open 25 hours a week. It's open from midnight to 5 a.m., 5 days a week. I don't know what your problem is, right? Like, no, we need to really think about how we meet the needs of students. One of the things that we haven't really talked about, but I think that is a big part of, and it's come up on so many of those conversation boards on Zulip is what does high quality assessment look like? What does it look like when we're not just giving the same kinds of tests that we've always given, whether that's for placement or within a class? And I think, like I mentioned before, really trying to align how we teach with how students learn. And so I just want to say I am so excited. I think we're at a place where there's so much room, like an explosion of growth possibility for us to increase student success across all different kinds of populations. Um, and if I'm on Zulip, I do hope that if you are not as part of that Amber group and you want to get on and talk to other teaching focused faculty, that you'll get on there. Obviously, if if you have some questions and follow-ups for me, you're welcome to email me directly, or you can message me on Zulip, and I'm happy to talk about this some more. But I just want to thank you all for, I know nobody has even an hour to spare, and to come and start thinking about this, and hopefully some light bulbs going off about like what might be possible at my institution, what might be possible where I am, and doing all the things that I really want to do to serve students. And so look at us with 3 minutes to spare, right? If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to stay on. Um,
I have a question, and thank you so much, Laura, for this presentation and your enthusiasm. It's contagious. It's wonderful. Um, this may be asking you to repeat what you've already said, but in terms of how this is handled from an administrative standpoint, co-requisite courses. Um, so one could do it fee based and say,
mhm.
you need to take this. You're not going to get college credit for it because there are, depending on the state, restrictions on what you can give students college credit
Yeah,
for.
yeah.
So, what could you repeat or say more about the different ways this has been handled successfully from an administrative standpoint?
Yeah, so I will say, so there are lots of different ways, but I will say almost always the way that I have seen it successfully is through the addition of credit hours. Okay, so but even that, and so that's not the only way, but even that structurally, there are a lot of different ways, right? So there are, like, if you're at a community college where part of your mission may be to offer courses that are below the 100 level, maybe you transcript this as two separate classes, one that is the parent class and one that is a prerequisite class that's under 100 level, and students have to, right, take them both and pair them together and all of those things, right? And that's not a problem. If you're at a place that, right, like there are plenty of universities for whom offering things below the 100 level is impossible, right? That is just not part of their, and that is not going to be a thing. And so then I have seen two different things that have happened there, even when they're still doing credits. One is to offer it as a standalone course. We are going to still offer this as a course in the same way that they might offer, a 100 level um, just orientation type course, or right first year. So they can offer it in that way as a 100 level a course that doesn't count as part of their QR, right? As part of their quantitative reasoning or mathematics. It can be more of a generic. And some of that, for some states, that means changing the naming convention, right? Like, and for some, they can still call it math, and they can just differentiate all of those things. It sort of depends. Um, and the other is literally for people to just change the number of credits. So for example,
Mhm.
I think it's not unusual. I don't know if people have this at their universities, but it's actually one of the common things is for people as in chemistry. It's one of the places where I've seen it the most, right? So people have, like fast or slow chemistry, depending on whether they've had chemistry in their high school before, or what level of chemistry. And basically they've used that same kind of structure in the math, right? So for students that have had pre-calculus before in their high school, they take a traditional 3 credit calculus one course. And if students have not had pre-calculus in their high school, they take a 4 credit calculus course, right? So they literally just make it they add the credit hour to the existing one course. And so administratively, I would say those are the most common. Like I said, you can get away with doing it using external fees, right? You can say it's a credit that, yeah, financial aid doesn't pay for, but the foundation is going to pay it as a fee, or student fees, or whatever. But I will tell you, those are so much harder to be sustainable. It's just really
Yeah.
hard both to build them that way, and then it's almost impossible to get rid of those structures if you want to then add the credit. So I am always a proponent of build it the way that it's going to be sustainable in the long run from the very
Right. Right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right. Again, I'm happy to stick around, but I know we're at the top of the hour, so thank you everyone, and good luck on your campuses doing great things.